So where are you going is a verse in the Quran that asks followers to ask themselves whether or not the direction that they're taking in this life is the right one, and and endorses them to go on the path of religion. For many years, I have believed in this particular principle, that the direction in my life is one of religiosity and one of Islam. But I think what's important is that this conflict within me can only be resolved with diverse opinions that only arise when we support these forms of diverse narratives that can only exist in the world of government. First point of framing then on new atheism. What is this? It's a contemporary version of atheism, which can exist on a spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum, it exists on criticism towards religion and its tenets, calling out religious beliefs as some being problematic. But secondly, we can also include things and defend things like insulting followers, right? Calling them misguided, calling them, saying to them that the fact that you are believing in the wrong belief system, and we are going to call you out for being a person who's misguided. Secondly, what is this particular belief based off? Three things. Number one, in terms of science, we call it out in terms of whether or not it makes sense in terms of science. Muhammad went up to the heavens in the night of Laylatul Qadr on a horse with wings. Secondly, Jesus being resurrected. I think we can point out scientific fallacies with this particular event through new atheism. Secondly, in terms of logic, where we point out contradictions, where Islam says you should cut off the fingertips of non-believers, but at the same time says your God is your God and my God is mine, where we can point out these religious inconsistencies that are important for not just believers to acknowledge, but also people outside of religion to get this information. Thirdly, then is philosophy. Now, I don't think we need to entertain arguments that talk about how people are going to be horrible without religion, why religion is the one that gives people principles. We have things like law that already regulates these things. We have already societal narratives that even if you say comes from religion, evolved into things more of a societal narrative that people without religion can still believe in. But secondly, then, I think the primary philosophy here is to act as a countervailing force against religion. Note here that there can be some proselytization, but this proselytization is different from religion. Number one, it's not institutionalized, where it's not going to be part of a church or it's not going to be integrated within states. But secondly, it convinces you through fact and logic as opposed to forcing you into belief just on the basis of faith. But thirdly, it doesn't rely on your donations. These are self-funded professors who rely on things like grants, who rely on things like self-funded versions to fund whatever books and stuff like that that you want to do. What does then this support look like? Number one, we validate this particular belief, that this belief is good. I guess this can be done by the state in some way. For example, Scandinavian models that still encourage some level of free thinking within their education systems and critical thinking towards belief systems. Secondly, we support more airtime, more debates, more podcasts, more talk shows, not more books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. No. Firstly, then, why is this a just belief? The premise of this argument is that we live in a world where ideals clash with each other. And because the world is growing increasingly more nuanced and we're getting a lot more opinions, I think this is just belief considering this era. This is where we see a lot of people becoming a-religious because they vibe with other forms of belief systems. Maybe I'm one who wants to go back to like what my ancestors used to practice, like animism, or I can be a lot more progressive as well with more liberal forms of beliefs. Why is this the case? Number one is inclusivity, where we include groups that are not currently represented by mainstream institutions. Like, for example, within Malaysia, we have Islam that's already integrated with the state. Therefore, Islam becomes the mainstream. Or even within the United States, within secular states, where we see that this becomes integrated within those states as well. I think it's important to include these groups that are probably not represented by the state. But also under inclusivity is the fringe belief system. I think we include a lot of things under fringe beliefs simply because they're small, right? In the past, these beliefs were ones that were oppressed as a result of being small. Therefore, the progressive view of this is to celebrate views that are small, is to give them airtime and to give them more support. But secondly, it's in line with systems of democracy, especially when the foundation of this belief is logic and science. Why is democracy and science intertwined? Number one is empirical evidence, where core tenets of political science still functions of things like data, your voter bases, your census, are all empirical forms of data. Secondly, we call out fake news. Every time Trump says shit, we charge him, right? When the fact that when he whined about election fraud, we charged him in courts and stuff like that. I think this proves that democracy cares about accuracy of information, etc. But thirdly, we deconstruct a huge power. Universally speaking, religion has had a lot of power, and this is something I'm going to discuss in my second argument about why this acts as a countervailing narrative. The impact of this argument is that we point out why diversifying is a net good. But secondly, I also talk about why we link democracy and science, and therefore we need to celebrate more views that are based off of science. But second argument then, why is this an important countervailing narrative? The premise of this argument is that religious institutions are just really huge. Why is this the case? Number one, historically speaking, they have had insane power. They used to operate in churches which literally used to control the law, right? Through things like religion, oppressing people of science, the Salem witch trials where they burned scientists on the stake, the persecution of intellectuals like Galileo who claimed things about the universe that religions didn't particularly believe in. But secondly, in status quo, even in secular states, they are huge. They are intertwined with states where politicians oftentimes use religious narrative in order to convince voters. But secondly, through the existence of mega churches and mega mosques, which are literally commercially in the mainstream and push for people to believe in them. How does this then happen? Number one, we support the rise, which means there's more opinions against religions, more debates among religious leaders and leaders of new atheism. But secondly, it's reparations and an alternative where victims of the past, both victims of the past, like intellectuals or science itself, have been insulted, have been offended, have been physically abused by the existence of religion. We get reparations for those individuals. But victims now who are currently in institutions and states that they can't show their irreligiosity, who are in families where they have to hide themselves and have to live a double life, we offer them not just catharsis in the fact that they don't have to believe in this, we offer them an alternative in dealing with internal conflict. But thirdly, then, is the liberation from the shackles of religion, where religion oftentimes results in a huge conflict internally for individuals. I think we give them that liberation, especially when that conflict is one that eats you up inside. What is the impact to this argument? How do we think religion will change for the better? Number one, if you can dish it out, then you can take it. I think we encourage more critical beliefs towards religion, more critical opinions that call out religion for these issues. So therefore, this results in it not being as controversial or problematic. They touch less kids because they know they are vulnerable and in a precarious position, right? They use less violent religious narratives because they know people might be turned off as a result. But secondly, then, is perception. I think we break this down into two things. Number one, for believers and middle grounders, I think we are more convinced of religion. The fact that religious leaders debate more and are able to speak towards leaders of new atheism, which means people who are watching probably see the beauty of their religion within this particular debates. The fact that my leader is able to speak out against such a prominent figure of new atheism. But secondly, for non-believers, I think the fact that they just respect religion. Previously, people didn't respect religion because they didn't want to engage with like opposing beliefs. The fact that we burned scientists, the fact that we didn't want to engage and we engage with intolerance whenever we did something. I think this is the point at which we get the respect that doesn't exist in their world. It's better for religion, but it's also a valid belief that needs to exist.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming for the next debate. Over the top, follow the leader of here.
Fear is the currency of individuals and institutions who claim to support God. It is fear against enemies of the church that bishops and priests use in order to galvanize followers against concepts like atheism, against concepts like reform, that only happens when you create an enemy for them to flag against. The first thing I'm going to do is flag out what it means in the world absent the rise. We would suggest that there are already a spectrum of individuals where there are individuals who may be ultra religious. There are also most people who are in the middle, religious people who can compartmentalize their religious and scientific beliefs, which is why we have things like Catholic and Islamic doctors, for example. We would suggest there's already some level of anti-religion and sentiment and criticism in the 21st century where this debate exists. The fact that there are concepts in religion that can self-criticize. So we say, or we impose sainthood on people like Thomas Aquinas, even though they were killed for being anti-religion. The fact that on a personal level, you as a person of which religion has been imposed upon them, have the natural incentive to feel as if you need to criticize. But thirdly, the fact that there's a global wave of liberalization and secularization happening in most states. Look at the examples that they use. We used to burn doctors at the stake. We don't do that anymore in the majority of the countries in the world. What this suggests is that there's already a state and individual incentive and preference towards scientific development. What religion does is it fills in the gaps of people who cannot believe science yet, or people who do not know what it means to be alive. The third thing I'm going to do then is note that second thing is that note that this is an overcorrection. It's an additional layer of criticism and speculation and towards religion. So it's things like, for all the things that PM explained, it's calling out individual people for being misguided. It's pointing out religious inconsistencies within institutions. What this suggests is you impose a sense of superiority of scientific belief onto religious followers, and that is inherently why it's bad. The last thing I'm going to do is just call out the logical leaps in government's case. If the way this manifests is in books and talk shows, it is unsure to me why people who are religious, who need it the most, will engage with it, and how it will infiltrate the personal beliefs of individuals. Secondly, if religion is powerful and totalizing, they have to prove why people are going to believe new atheists over the religious leaders who they probably have more personal and more intimate connections with. And I'd like to note lastly that we support atheism as a concept. We support atheism existing in our world. What we don't support is the rise of new atheism, and why specifically it antagonizes religion and makes it harder for religion to develop down. The first argument I'm going to launch is why it created unnecessary divisions between religious people and new atheists. The first is that new atheism has collectivized people on the basis of hate and rejection of religion. It is the outright rejection and criticism of religious beliefs and religious practices, which means belittling and discrediting things like blessings for the sick, for example. It is the absolute superiority of one concept of one over another, which is why we have books telling you that God is dead, that religion doesn't exist, and that it's false. Compare this to other belief systems parallel to religion. So the initial stance of atheism, for example, where they may not opt into religion, but they allow religion to exist and they allow people to believe in it and find solace in it. And I'd like to note that this isn't different from any sort of religious hate, because scientific ideology is another belief system that you're imposing onto people. It's not different from religious conflict, because it is the imposition of superiority of belief onto other people that might believe differently. The second thing is why it makes it harder for reforms to happen within religion. It's the fact that religious leaders can point to any point of reform as an attempt to erase the religious beliefs. So people who will try to run reforms within the religion, Islamic women who tell people that they are uncomfortable with the ultra-conservative manifestation of Islamic beliefs within their countries, Catholic women who are forced to not opt into scientific or high-paying jobs, for example, because they believe that they have to be mothers. These are the people that often forward reforms in religion, but because they are associated with new atheism and because there is a rise and religions are feeling more and more threatened, those people are not listened to. And that's exactly why we don't support the rise of it, right? Because as it becomes a greater and greater threat towards religion, which is a prerequisite to government's benefits of reforms and solace happening, then that is when religions tend to fight back. Whereas comparatively, when you allow religions to evolve naturally, they have better credibility because the reform happens from people within the religion and they're not associated to an enemy of that religion. The fact that religions already have an incentive to reform and to change anyway, by virtue of, again, the fact that there's an increasing pressure on them from the state and from individuals because of liberalization and secularization, that they have to opt into things like charities, building hospitals, building schools in developing countries. These are all reforms that happen absent new atheism. Lastly, I'm going to tell you why it has led to that scientific backsliding within developing countries at the point at which you export it to countries that already have some strong amount of religious power. The first is I'd like to talk about where it comes from. It is people in developed countries, in the developed world, that are often associated with Western colonialism. It is the proponents of this belief system are often rich, often white, often male individuals. And the reason for this is because these are the people who can find solace, in things that are other than religion, find solace in things like wealth, find solace in the fact that they have a greater capacity to live in their developed and privileged countries than people who, for example, live in poverty, minorities who face oppression, and therefore they have to believe in the idea that there's something greater than them. What this suggests then is that there's a poisonous association between new atheism and other demonized and antagonized concepts like colonialism and like whitewashing. And what happens then is fear mongering. It's the fact that religions and political leaders can weaponize this belief system in order to leverage their own power. The fact that you can flip the superiority complex within new atheism and tell people that they are against our religion. I am not, and therefore you should vote for me. You should listen to me. That's why senators in the Philippines, like Manny Pacquiao, like Vico Soto, for example, are able to galvanize so many of their followers towards antagonizing divorce laws and same-sex marriage laws in the Philippines, which is why we haven't progressed. Because all of these things are associated with new atheism. All of these things are associated with the West. And that is how you get backsliding in these kinds of countries. So we would suggest then, lastly, that it has triggered an assault against atheism in developing countries. People, unlike government frames, people in developing countries are not able to choose to become atheists, to choose to opt out of their religion, because religions become stronger when you create an enemy against them, when you frame atheism as something that is inherently critical and inherently bad. For all those reasons, opposed.
Thank you very much, Melvin, for your speech to extend the case for from here.
In order for their case to be true, they had to illustrate why a diverse form of opinions that counteracts each other, there is a balance, no symmetry of power, to be true, to exist first. Insofar as our first speech characterizes why there's an asymmetry of power and influence over religious institutions, over smaller factions like atheism to be true, they haven't dislodged it and just counter-asserted a context. Here's how I'm going to structure this speech. First, I'm going to do some housekeeping, which I'll really explain what the direction of this debate calls for. Number one, I want to take note of the context. Their context was there's some level of already anti-religious movements, and there's a natural aversion of people pivoting to science. Note that their backing of this context was twofold. Number one, intuition pump, like Critique or Aquinas, they didn't explain why this was a majority opinion that is some majority opinion that people have. But secondarily, they don't explain why there's a natural individual sentiment to oppose inherently. They don't explain the context of this, how pervasive it is, and why is this true. Insofar as I'm pointing out this critique, they've never successfully dislodged Hassan's claim to talk about the symmetry of power. This leads me nicely to explaining why the symmetry of power is likely to exist. First, the symmetry of power exists in most contexts, whether it's illiberal states or liberal states. Why? In secular states, religious institutions are tax exempted, meaning they are still given a direct beneficiary to continue the offenses and to create a sphere of influence. In non-secular states, religious institutions are constitutionally given power where there are sub-states in those countries where the sphere of influence in terms of also proselytizing norms and lifestyle is pervasive. I'm explaining to you structurally why in both liberal and illiberal states, there's an asymmetry of power, either by way of government intervention or policy by giving tax breaks, or by constitutionally giving power by way of law. In both these instances, the sphere of influence is large. That's why Hassan told you why there's even existence of things like mega churches, which is more conglomerated, bigger versions that spread out power. They've never dislodged this, and counter-asserted people can just have their natural affinity to law. Second critique, on principle, they are okay with atheism, right? Because they said they're okay at some levels of atheism just coalescing naturally. Two tenses that this does to their case. Number one, if they said new atheism is fundamentally okay, they just don't want to support the rise, then this has a tense with your initial claim to say why this is predicated on hate. All the criticism that is predicated on hate and brings so much of hate is now a tense if you say new atheism is something that's okay to exist naturally. But secondly, this also has a tense with your initial claim to say people have a natural affinity to science. Because if you say people have a natural affinity to science, but they will be deviating from new atheism because it's imposing, why is it that your mechanisms of your status quo are likely to be true? What is this important? I'm explaining to you also that religious conflicts manifested in history that Hassan talked to you about. Troubles, Holy Crusades, for example, actively ostracized minority by virtue of scientific and intellectual being oppositional to religion. No response on why the massive amount of discrimination that happened to the minorities in the past till now was something we need to give reparations for. They focused on right now, which I will debunk later. What am I proving here? I'm proving here that number one, their counter assertion of the context had absolutely no backing. And second, I'm proving to you why our characterization is true for two reasons. Number one, I'm proving to you it's true in applicable contexts across the world, not just in selective contexts. And second, I'm giving you intuition pump to back why our context is true. They first had to dislodge it before asserting the context. Before that, I'll take a point.
Yes. The proceedings ended, the witch trials ended, not because of new atheism, but we had an enlightenment movement. We have a general trend of people believing in sciences as more and more people are educated. You have to defend your side that is a radicalized form of this.
I don't know why we have to defend a radicalized form, because especially when we're in a novelty and supporting the rise, it won't take form in the worst forms of evil fashion as you talked about. But secondarily, I don't know why you're specifically talking about whether or not atheism was the remedy to ending that war. The very fact that atheists were attacked because they were non-followers was the crucial fulcrum of the particular argumentation. Second call out I want to make is the evaluation of burden. Note that their case was that in order for us to win this debate, we needed to have structural reform of religion. This is a fallacy. We do not need to change hierarchical structures or doctrines of religion in order to access our benefit. Three things that Asan explains to you were benefits that win us the round that were never engaged and that had nothing to do with structural reform. Number one, that this is a justified form of speech. We need to support the rise of any speech that's in a minority because we live in a world where ideals clash with each other. That's why we support fringe groups, for instance, for the celebration of identity, because these things are in the minority. They didn't explain why the justification is bad. They just have a tense with the rise. But second, we're supporting the rise to be even more inclusive. If our context was true that a majority chokehold has over minority followers, we need to be more inclusive to get more accreditation to beliefs that are backed with science, beliefs that are anti-religion because they feel reparations because religion abused them. And third, this is in line with democracy. Democracy is a balance of ideals and necessitates that people's opinions can be freely expressed. Yes, there's some shares of influence that differ at a point in which you give accreditation to it, but that's why it counteracts, because the first claim to be true, which is that this is something that is right. That's why our benefits is not pegged to reformation of religion. All these three benefits are important to way to give rise to credence of minorities in the first place. They had to be more charitable. Final part of the call out is on weighing. They said currently the most forms of religious followers are going to be hated by this ideal. Here's how I'm going to debunk this. Two mitigations as to why the worst forms of fashion that they talked about won't coalesce. Number one, the new atheism is a spectrum of followers, meaning not all will be into the most extreme versions of hate, because sometimes it can be some level of joke, humor, using rhetorics like science and logic, deal with those framings as well and explain why those contexts are something that is bad. Don't deal with the worst end. Second, hate crimes. If you really manifest in direct threat of violence, laws are there to curtail hate crimes. Thirdly, the sanctity of religious institutions. There are laws and norms to protect outsiders from coming and then saying stupid things in the mosque because it's seen as sacred. These are three mitigations that literally limits the sample space of the harm they talked about. But even it's the worst form of harm, why is this okay? Number one, religious emphasizes on faith and religiosity despite challenges. It is the idea that we need to combat worldly pleasures like don't drink, for instance. This will still be seen as something that is in line with that if it's the case that we spread it. What's the likely outcome? On the fence followers are the ones who are going to be impacted in our world. These are people who are probably moderate, diehard people or followers are not going to be changed, we agree, but we don't need the benefits of our case to materialize to change by bigoted people to begin with. But people on the fence are the ones that are likely to be impacted. The very fact that on scale, some people question, some people challenge, is already increasing the number of people that believe in this ideal that gives credence to the very minority that we talked about. The bottom line is, in our world, is when supporting the rise counteracts the prevalent narrative that exists. More importantly, the increase of on-the-fence people questioning is already a net benefit, and for all these reasons, incredibly proud to govern.
Thank you very much, DPM, for the excellent speech. And opposition, let's call the deputy leader.
Okay. All right. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. Absolute condemnation just breeds absolute hate. And this was the premise of most of the Crusades. We think that the repeat of that, now with the use of scientific beliefs instead of another belief system is any no different. It's not any different. Two things I'll do in this speech. The first is I'll engage on issue on on the principle of democracy on government bench and how they contradict this a lot on their side. The second is I'll extend on solace, and I'll engage on the best and the most mild manifestation of new atheism, which is in general just saying that everything religious is invalid or everything that is tied to spiritual belief is invalid, and we only need to validate things that are backed by scientific process and reason. The first thing I want to just do is just clean up what the debate ought to be. I want to point out why new atheism is radical and they can't defend one where it is of a spectrum of beliefs. The first is, note the info side. It is a more outspoken and aggressive criticism of religious beliefs and practices. This is inherently radical because it's not you just putting in doubt or putting in question certain aspects of religion. It is you saying that this is absolutely terrible, this is absolutely bad, we should not leave this to any discussion. Secondly, note that it points that scientific reasoning reigns superior over religious faith. So it advocates for the superiority, not tolerance, not doubt on religious beliefs, but one that says that it is absolutely inferior to anything and everything scientific. Note that that is the scenario of new atheism and new atheism as a movement and not general idea of atheism that just says maybe the world actually doesn't have a god or we don't have to have religion for us to live dignified lives. The second thing then, sit down. The second thing then is just a response to just a couple of extraneous responses. First is on the power asymmetry. Note that there is no change on their side. Everything that they've said, the fact that religion is still tax exempted, the fact that a lot of people listen to a lot of the religious leaders, are things that still remain true on their side of the house. If they said that there is a spectrum of followers, people who absolutely listen to their religious leaders, people who are moderate about it, and people who are passive with the way that they interact with the religion, this is a dangerous concession because this means that you didn't need the new atheist movement for people to opt in and out of religion, given that inherently people just have a spectrum of beliefs and a spectrum of ways in which they opt into this. But lastly, if you believe that the power asymmetry is so strong and religions have a stronghold in specific context, then you have to believe our harm, which is that there is massive pushback to a movement that absolutely demonizes them, that absolutely threatens their very existence. Lastly, I want to point out that the natural trend was something that is reasonable for us to believe. Aside from it being empirically true, right? Like the new atheist movement was on the 21st century, very recently. But things like religious reforms happened during the Enlightenment movement and even within like their own religions. If anything, we'd say that most reforms in religion were done by religious people because these are individuals who have merit, who have the credibility because they're the ones who interact with texts more and are able to leverage those changes, not those who are radically not even in the religion to begin with. But secondly, all of the things we explained, the self-interest of states to, for example, have a healthier community, that more people get an education, and that's why they're more likely to be discursive and be open to other ideas. The fact that scientific innovation is inherent and something that's institutionalized already are reasons to believe that people on our side of the house are not ones that are die-hard, ultra-religious conservatives, but ones that are open to ideas. What we don't like is a demonization of religion that literally backtracks a lot of this progress because now you have an enemy that religious individuals can now back and go behind from. Before that, POI.
Islam calls on followers to cut the fingertips of non-believers. Don't you think a radical belief like this requires more aggressive and outspoken counter?
No, because that is not how you, one, you can't reason with these types of people. Two, is that I don't think most people in Islam believe this, right? Like the average most Muslim person doesn't believe in cutting off the fingers of their enemies. We'd even say, right, that we'd even say again that it's not exclusive. You can have religious criticism on the base of religion. Like you can have the sacred text and the sacred scripture, Allah saying that He is benevolent, to criticize that. We don't know why you need new atheism to do that mechanism in particular. First issue then is in democracy. And I want to point out, right, what we are okay with rejecting. We're okay with rejecting certain fringe groups, right? That's why we don't support all groups like extremists, like those who promote intolerance, because they actively undermine other people's freedom of speech. So for sure, in the same way that new atheist movements do this as well, because they're intolerant to other religions in general, are the reasons as to why that this is not in line with their particular democracy. But secondly, the proliferation of beliefs means that you have to allow religions to exist. That doesn't exist in a world where you believe that scientific reasoning is absolute. Telling them that they are misguided, telling them that just because you believe in religion means that we shouldn't consider your beliefs anymore and we have to listen to science, is exactly things that undermine democracy to begin with. But secondly, under the freedom of belief, we explain that it becomes unsafe for people who are involved with religion. For people who are atheists, they're preemptively persecuted in more religious places because religious leaders and religious institutions will think that you potentially can opt into the new atheism movement. We have to crack down any types of exposure to beliefs that criticize religion because we don't want you to become more radicalized. That doesn't happen on our side of the house when you just have the natural trend of people liberalizing within the religion, either because they genuinely want change or the fact that they just aren't attacking religion in general. But secondly, on reformists, right? Because it's true that there are people within religion that want to reform the religion. And the reason as to why that's true is one, because they live within this religion. They have a personal stake into wanting it to become better. But secondly, that's the only option. Like in most states, you don't have the option to become atheist because even if you are not legally persecuted, it's the fact that your family and friends and your community cares about you opting into religion. And that's why they reformed this. You make it harder for reformists to actually get these changes because the initial criticism is that you might be associated with the new atheism movement and we need to demonize you and to cast you out of the community instead of one that we listen to you because we think that you genuinely care about us. That's how we win on democracy and more reforms within religion. Lastly is in solace. When everything has to have reason, when everything unscientific is invalid, this deprives terminally ill patients, those who have low chances of surviving common diseases, such as the poor, those with precognitive diseases, of being able to provide solace and catharsis. The problem with science and innovation is that it has its limits. We don't know, for example, what happens after you die. We don't know, for example, if you will live past 30 when you have cancer at the age of 25. What religion particularly does is that it provides you hope. It provides you comfort. And I want to point out that this is the most salient because it's unsure as to whether or not we're able to meaningfully change religious institutions on their side of the house if they're very, very powerful, or how people opt in and out of religion meaningfully. But it's about not depriving those who need religion as a solace by having new atheism tell them that you are doomed because science has no answers for you. We are very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gio, for the excellent speech. To continue the case for government.
The biggest problem of this team is that they have very convenient analytical rigor. What do I mean by this? First, they tell you that if you push back against religion, the religion will become antagonistic and it will prevent any forms of reform. But in the same breath, they tell you that the age of enlightenment after the Holy Crusade is a result of people within this religion accepting the validity of science and research and becoming more progressive. So which is it? Is religion progressive enough to understand that when science challenges it, that we accept it and move forward? Or is it that anyone who is part of this new atheistic movement, if they challenge religion, religion will then become antagonistic towards them, shit on their families, and prevent them from accessing any benefits at all? That is why they lose this debate, because they are not being consistent in any version of their framing. Additionally, they are not proving any similarities. They are just proving duties of states. What do I mean by this? First, they tell you that this is similar to the Holy Crusade. Why is this similar to the Holy Crusade? Because it's absolute condemnation. Yes, it is absolute condemnation, but it is not similar in any way of the word. Richard Dawkins is not claiming that we must burn everyone who believes in Christianity. Richard Dawkins is not claiming that we need to burn men or women because they are not as perfect as whoever it is. They're not claiming that if you don't believe in this, you are wrong and you will die a terrible death. That is completely untrue. And we argue that, in fact, even if there is absolute condemnation, which is the worst case on our side, because this is still the rise of a new movement, we are completely okay with that because it is firstly a reparation to what has happened in the past. And secondly, this is what is most likely going to moderate religion the most. Even if we have to claim, even if we have to bite the bullet and accept some retaliation from religion, we will accept this retaliation because on both frames, we claim that religion is not that extreme to the level that both sides are claiming, except in very, very specific pockets. Next, they tell you status quo, we don't fund extremist groups, groups like terrorists, groups that commit to violence. Again, you all have the burden to prove why new atheism is an extremist group, especially when time and time again, Asan has told you, this is a nascent group on the rise, and as people who we are giving and people who are supporting them, we are most likely going to support the most moderate forms of this idea, and most people are going to buy into this idea if it is publicized in its most moderate form. I'm uncertain as to why the incentive is to be as extreme as possible and to be as stupid as possible, especially when they cannot combat the willingness of the state. The last thing is spectrum of followers. We don't need this. Then what's the point of debating, right? If you argue that there's already a natural incentive or push to atheism and principally you're okay with atheism, you don't argue or show the nuance of new atheism and how it is inconsistent with general principles of atheism, especially when the info slide tells you they are mainly founded on science and religion. They use two words from the info slide: aggressive criticism and being outspoken. My guy, that is literally every group in the world that is unhappy. Does that mean they are extreme? Does that mean they are radical? Does that mean they want aggressive change for everything? I doubt it. The LGBT movement is aggressively outspoken and aggressively criticizing all the harms that they face and being outspoken. Does that mean they are radical? And does that mean we should not allow them to exist, to communicate their ideas in democracy? I don't think so. Before I move to my next question, yes.
You're brave at the end that you call out people for being misguided because they believe in religion. Why is the person going to listen to you?
Okay, but we argue that since you say there's a spectrum, and number two, Asan tells you for the most radicalized individual in religion, we cannot change them. That is not the value of this debate, especially when there is a rise. Kuhan tells you we are targeting those in the middle ground. Kuhan tells you we are targeting those that are conflicted. Asan tells you individuals who have been lied to by religion all this while, if they get some level of information disproving based on empirical truth that this is wrong, they are more likely to leave. We cannot prove that in every circumstance this person will leave. If that is the only way in which we can achieve victory, that is not possible. Next question, where do we get the best of religion? Firstly, I want to clarify the weighing here. The two things that we get is, first, we argue that when you have reasonable opposition, you are more likely to enrich both. And Asan has already given you the analysis of the argument, how this will impact religious believers and non-religious believers. Secondly, we argue this is the best path of moderation. They argue that for religion to be moderated, you need two things. First, religion needs to have a monopoly on fear because they use this fear as a tool to continuously grow and expand, and any threat to that fear will mean retaliation. Secondly, they tell you that the minorities within this religion, if they are associated with new atheist movement, they will then be ostracized by the religion, and these are the people that are progressing this movement, these religions. My first question is, what is the analysis as to minorities having power and control and monopoly within these religions to call them out to change? If you are relying on Age of Enlightenment, which was don't know how long ago, you are not cognizant of all the oppressions of religion that is happening currently. Sharia law in most Islamic countries that force these individuals to undergo hudud trials, hudud laws, and if you fail to follow religious structure within the Sharia, within the hudud, you are gone. You are penalized and you are persecuted. That is the truth of today. In certain instances in South America, if you are LGBT movement or if you are part of minorities that are culturally and historically disenfranchised, you are not going to be given a piece of truth to speak on religion and how you can cause them to change. So even in the worst case, they become ostracized by this religion. We first argue they are already ostracized anyway. And secondly, and more importantly, it is in our world, they are more likely to feel more comfortable because we are not telling them inherently as a result of your birth, you are not valuable to this religion. That is a claim that we are disproving from the beginning because that is the foundation of what new atheism is, that which is directly inconsistent with what religion is. Last question, last layer of this analysis is that they tell you this is similar to colonialism. What is, again, the similarity of this is, the premise of this is that the leaders of this movement are white men. So many things are leaders of white men. The leader of of Amazon is a white man. Does that mean it's a colonial company? Does that mean it's satisfying principles of colonialism? Again, I'm uncertain as to how they meet these metrics of similarities when they do any weightage of analysis to prove this point compared to our side, which completely proves and provides you with multiple intuition pumps for each layer of our analysis. What do I mean by this? First, we tell you that there exists a power asymmetry in status quo, and because of this power asymmetry, all of our layers of providing support towards this rise of these movements is the only way in which we can counterbalance this asymmetry. We are not going to achieve change in the short term immediately in terms of moderating this religion, but in the short term, what we will get is more acceptance of these ideals, more airtime of these ideals, more understanding of these ideals, allowing these ideals to grow, and then becoming a more powerful force against religion, which will then make them scared and become more moderated. That is the clear path of victory for government that they have yet to engage with beyond all of this stuff. We also have stuff about democracy. I think that was done well enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Go for the next speech. Now, summarize and part of all the case and all of the very good.
My parents are extreme Jesus fans, but this government team has made me realize how ridiculous my principles of new atheism are because they will never convince my parents at the dinner table. There are two things I want to clarify on what this debate truly is about. The first thing is that they assert that new atheism exists on a spectrum. We agree, maybe it is outspoken and maybe it is aggressive, but it is ridiculous to say that these new atheists can be tempered because that is the literal definition of 21st century atheism, absent new atheism. But the second thing I point out is read the literal info slide. Even if they assert that the LGBTQIA plus community can be outspoken and aggressive, they can't just assert their gender to be superior of straight people. That is new atheism. You assert scientific facts to be superior over religious doctrine, which is why they can't just argue for it to exist on a spectrum. The second thing I point out is that this is a rise debate. The rise creates extreme external enemies that religions can rally against, and this is the principal mechanism that they never engage with. The nuances, even if there are no significant portions of individuals that are extremely religious, people who are associated with new atheism will immediately turn off individuals from that religious groups. If there's no atheism, if there's no association with new atheism, this is where all of their benefits can only work. It is not convenient analysis from our DLO, it's good debating. First issue, where do we best preserve the value of belief systems? Because this is what they want to assert. They want to democratize, they want to consider this as a just belief because it's apparently inclusive and accurate. 3 responses. 1, this is untrue because you literally exclude the people in the middle of the religious spectrum if they want to really talk about spectrum. Note that DPM concedes to this, that there are individuals who you can easily sway in the middle of the religious spectrum. There are religious doctors, there are individuals who can be swayed with atheist beliefs. What they do and what is important is that these are the people who you want to believe in if they really want to have more followers, people who you want to convince. What happens on their side is that you radicalize individuals to be more on the religious spectrum if they really want to fight for that. The people in the middle, now that there's an association of new atheism to be incredibly critical and incredibly radical against religion, that is where you sway the people in the middle less. But even if you buy the analysis coming from GovWhip, I think to point out, right, that you will only include people who will never want to agree with religion in the first place. You will only include extremists. You will only include radical individuals that don't want to associate with religions. It is unclear to me how incredibly radical and incredibly superiority-based forms of rhetoric will encourage individuals who are in the middle, will encourage individuals to be at least, reformed or to be not misguided on their side of the house. But even if you still don't buy that response, this still happens on our side of the house, guys. Atheism will still exist on our world. The crucial difference is new atheism leads individuals to be incredibly radical, leads individuals to be incredibly aggressive. So even if their spectrum is correct, their spectrum is A, the individuals will call you misguided, B, they will shit on your religion, C, they'll probably throw the Bible and the book or the Quran around. So I don't understand why the spectrum is necessarily good. The second thing they argue is that you should be able to respect belief systems. You should be able to respect belief systems, and that you should be able to recognize this. Two responses. One, got check this, right? This is not going to be like boardroom chit chats, right? New atheism does not work that way. New atheism movements usually rally individuals to fight for religions to be inferior, to fight for their beliefs to be superior. This is something that they don't engage with. They only engage with the softest forms of their case, which I would argue is the lazy rigor analysis that GovWhip says we have. But the second thing is that even if you buy that, even if we don't respect our beliefs to an extent, it is still fine, because the individuals who are swayed on our side of the house, the individuals who want to opt into religion or who want to opt into scientific beliefs, have the freedom of expressing that right, have the freedom of expressing what they want to believe in. There is no ostracization that happens on our side of the house. It is unclear why does that happens on their side. Before I explain what were our contributions to this issue, go.
You said if people are associated with New Age atheism, they will turn off religious people and all this stuff will materialize. What if they're associated with regular religious atheism?
And then that's not new atheism. That's not the side you're fighting for. I don't understand why you say that, oh, these individuals can be tempered. That's not the characterization of new atheism, guys. Go check the responses. Go check the framing that even comes from their prime minister. It's incredibly inconsistent. What did we explain in terms of this issue? We explained that scientific reasoning is just another belief system that individuals have to be swayed from. You have to have support. You have to have individuals believing in your belief systems, even if at this point in time in the 21st century, majority of individuals believe in. We never said that people will have a natural affinity to science. But even if you believe that, right, this isn't the Enlightenment period anymore. We already explained from Alex that that period is finished. At this point in time, there is a greater incentive to want to believe in different ideas at the point in which individuals are enlightened. They don't explain as to why that analysis falls. Therefore, you have to buy our analysis that scientific reasoning flourishes more on our side of the house and can coexist with religion. They say three things, right? The first thing they explain is that, oh, there is a power asymmetry on our side of the house. But again, guys, even if there's power asymmetry, you further exclude the small population that is barely existing in developing countries. So even if there's a small population of new atheists on their side, then obviously, guys, they're going to be further marginalized, they're going to be further problematized and are framed as individuals, as demons, because they don't want to engage with the religious groups on their side of the house. The second thing they explain is that, oh, religions also have white men. But look at the to which these white men will operate on their side of the house. White men will literally explain that science is superior over religious doctrine. White men will explain why all of these things that they believe in developing countries are going to be better, which is unclear to me as to how they're going to sway the individuals from developing countries. This is exactly the analysis that they miss on their side of the house. But the last thing I'd like to point out in terms of mechanism, right, is they don't make this, right? Even if there's going to be power asymmetry, it's just barely unclear to me as to why that will eventually lead religions to flourish or lead scientific thought to flourish, which is like obviously already makes the case for. Last issue, where do we best get to protect the vulnerable from religions? They say it's a countervailing narrative. You have to give reparations and we have to protect people from cutting their fingers off. Three responses. The first thing we explained from Alex is there are already self-criticizing mechanisms that check and balance religions. So it's the fact that women Catholics can still fight against the church at the point in which their rights are incredibly marginalized. It's the fact that Catholic Filipinos are fighting for divorce, but the main association of divorce being in new atheist and incredibly radical thought is something that turns them away against them. So this means to say that there's still going to be check and balance mechanisms on our side of the house. It is on their side where you further overcorrect this and you further not get the change that you want. But the second thing I point out is that they will cut up their fingers more on their side of the house, guys, because if your religious leader thinks that new atheism says that, oh, you should not cut up your fingers, you are disgraced, obviously they'll be incentivized to cut off other people's fingers more because they don't prove as to why this is a good good and a beneficial change that happens on their side of the house. They don't prove all of these mechanisms, right? The only thing this team does is throw a bunch of impacts and call it a day. We explain two clear things. One, that individuals are able to uphold their belief systems more at the point in which you don't radicalize and impose a superiority over a religious doctrine. But the second thing we point out is that there's scientific pushback because they don't engage with all the worst harms. We explain that we further convince my parents better than the people.
Thank you very much, Optic, and that concludes the substantive part of this debate. Give the vice certification for Octofinals.
Speech start in 3, 2, 1. Free speech still exists on our side of the house because you can still have your ideas about religion. I think government bench conflates being critical of religion to defending an idea or a belief system that asserts the superiority of science over religion. We explain three things in particular. I'll explain three things in particular and why we win over it. The first is in terms of democracy. The second is in terms of reforms. And lastly, in power asymmetry and meaning. Before that, two things here. Firstly, this is a supports debate. So government bench has to defend how new atheism currently is forming and currently is manifesting. Secondly, they can't claim impacts on which it hasn't happened yet. So they can't say eventually new atheism will be so big, it will overcome Sharia law, it will make all religions not tax exempt anymore, and destabilize the Catholic Church. They have to make a lot of rigorous mechanism here, and the timeline problem that we presented down the bench as to why that is not likely to happen. The first thing then is on democracy, right? They said that they claim that we need absolutely free speech and fringe groups. We explained that inherently new atheism undercuts those values. The first is because it asserts absolute belief, which means on their side, there's no discourse, there's no doubt, there's no room for tolerance, because you already assert predisposedly before you go to the debate room that science always has to trump over religion. The second thing is that on the defense of fringe groups, we are okay with this. We trade off extremist groups. We trade off groups that literally call for the extinction of particular religious groups because they all of other religious groups because they literally advocate against the rights of more groups of people. New atheism literally deprives the existence of most, if not all, religious groups, and that's why this is particularly terrible. So already on principle of democracy, we win this. You have to believe that the new atheism movement is bad because it's of the fact that it clamps down on criticism of religion and it just counter asserts another belief in its place. The second thing then is on reforms, right? Now I want to point out that all of government's mechanisms work against them. It's the fact that new atheist movement literally assert that you have no choice but to leave your church, that your religion is absolutely wrong and there's no doubt that can be inserted into it, that you're a misguided person for believing into that God. And their only response is to say, well, we want to sway the people in the middle. But the people in the middle interact with the religious leader more frequently every week. The average religious person interacts with their family and their community that happens to be religion. It's unclear why the average person on their side of the house are ones who go to specifically new atheism talk shows, buy specifically new atheism books, which they said is their frame coming from first. And that's why we explain, like in terms of belief, you don't get the reforms coming from government bench, but you get it on our side of the house. Lastly, is on power asymmetry. They don't prove how it gets better. And there's a timeline problem, right? Because they admit new atheism as a movement is a nascent religion, a nascent movement. But a lot of the structures of religion, such as it being enshrined in law, such as it having large amounts of resources and being tax exempt, exists on our side. And that's why you have to believe our harm, that it triggers preemptive crackdown on people who are atheists, on people who are reformists, because they don't want them to be radicalized into being new atheists that absolutely doesn't believe in religion at all. And note that their framing of these books and talk shows have no ways of doing this. Lastly, even if you don't believe anything on our side of the house, what remains standing is the ability for religion to provide meaning and catharsis for people who can't find solace to science and reasoning. We explain that in the most moderate forms of new atheism, and it just invalidates all types of like religious beliefs and spirits, you deprive people who are in their deathbeds, who don't have any hope, but just has the afterlife looking forward them, of the comfort that religion specifically provides. And that is something that we think is terrible. For all those reasons and more, side with op, please.
Thank you very much. Op reply, formally provide the bias government.
For their team to win, you had to buy that a critique on religion is radical extremism. You had to buy that the coalescing of scientific community magically existing is true. Note panel, if you buy their frame, you are also acknowledging that our suggestion that suggests diversity was not true. Our suggestion that we have mitigations against their worst forms of harm was not true. You had to believe that our context that prove why the bigger evil here is religion and structurally prove why minorities are discriminated is not true. Before you buy that, deal with the weighing on ours. Two parts to this reply. First, housekeeping. I'll take a note of three things here. Number one, I want to take note of context. We suggested religious institutions are powerful, that are constitutionally given power, that manifest in regressive laws in places like Sharia law in certain circumstances, that have massively and historically oppressed intellectuals. They assert a natural scientific community. No response on why this is likely. We gave intuition pump, we gave diversity of context, we explained why our context was true. Their only response to our context was, if our context was true, nothing will change. But the observation you have to take note here is that they didn't explain why the context was not true, which means the scale of harms that they talked about were not true if religious is powerful. Second, contradictions. I'm going to hammer home with this part. First, they say we are okay principally with new atheism, but this is bad because it's based on hate. But this is bad because science is bad that you can give hope, don't give hope to terminally ill. If they're principally okay, a lot of their critics are also fundamentally not okay. There's a tense here. Which is it? Second, when we ask them, if Islam asks you to stone the gays, what would be the likely reaction? They say people won't believe. Again, so weird. Somehow their radical violence, people won't believe selectively it's too violent. But our proselytization, somehow everyone will believe and you'll go into war. Which is it? The likely scenario or rationality of people is flip-flopping under the other side of the house. If they concede that people just turn off and won't believe, if people ask you to cut fingers, perfect. All the harms that he talked about won't happen. They won't be offended in the first place if they turn that off. Third part, what this info slide suggests. They said outspoken and aggressive means radical and no discussion. This is the step. Why is this frame unfair? Number one, science celebrates discussion. That's why it's no discussion, it's wrong. Second, a rise supports a spectrum. That's our contention. That's why when we support the rise, we have control and autonomy of what we platform. That means opinions that are unambiguously targeting and hating are things we can deplatform because we have control over the narrative rather than the status quo where we don't. This, in terms of technicality, prove why they're out of the debate. Second part to this reply, what is the metric of change? They claim that change is only when you radically and structurally reform religion. First response, if you say that there will be no change because leaders on the top are bad, that proves our context of why leaders are bad. The influence is so large, which has justification of why at least attempting to counteract or challenge this institution is a net good. Second, all our mitigation to talk about why hate crime laws prevents the worst form of violence, including your cutting fingers and war that you talked about, sanctity of religious institutions that prevent outsiders from going, were all mitigations against the worst form of harm, absolutely not responded. And wait, thirdly, why wasn't our burden fair? When we explain that the context atheism is a minority, we support the rise to give credence to more people because of inclusivity, because of democracy, because of reparations. This was fair game in the debate. It didn't explain why structural reform was the only burden that was fair, insofar as this was also fair if our context was true. Finally, even if it's harmful, religion is far more radical and harmful. When we explain Sharia law, when we explain religious conflicts, these are all weighing metrics you need to consider because the exclusivity of harm on their side of the house that they claim are going to be radical is 10 times more in the world that religion institution exists. More importantly, on the fence people was our target audience. Yes, they may not change today. We don't have to make them change tomorrow or today. More on the fence people questioning themselves, questioning the reality, giving more dissent against religion has a growing influence of that. This can happen in 20 years, 30 years, even if 100 years later only we have a new atheist mosque. It is fine because at least we're starting now to go against the conglomerate religion that is for far too long have been banned. For those reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much.